Hello, everyone, and welcome back to day two of the IBE conference and to the session entitled Communal and Ancestral Knowledge for Our Black Children's Survival. My name is Nicole Oglesby, and I'm Director of P20 Educational Alliances at IUPUI, and I will be your moderator for this session. Today's session is going to be a good one where we have faculty and instructors from the IU School of Education, and I will introduce each of them. But before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping rules or things that you need to be aware of. The first is please hold your questions to the end. You can put them in the chat and we will try to get to as many as we can. Secondly, there will be a link in the chat that will be the survey. Make sure that if you don't get to click directly on the link, that you copy it and paste it into your web browser so that you can fill out the survey. It's important because it will help us in preparing next year's conference, but also in giving us feedback about each session. So the next thing I'd like to do is show a poll that our presenters would like for you to fill out, and I will also go ahead and introduce them. So with us today, we have Dr. Lasana Kazimbi. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Teacher Education within the IU School of Education at IUPUI, and in the Africana Studies program in the IUPUI School of Liberal Arts. He's a scholar of urban education, global Black arts movements, and the Black intellectual tradition. We also have Dr. Sina Skelton, who is the Director of Operations for the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center and instructor within the IU School of Education at IUPUI. She is also the editor of the Multiple Voices, Disability, Race, and Language Intersections in Special Education Journal. Third, we have Dr. Natasha Flowers. Dr. Flowers is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Urban Teacher Education within the School of Ed at IUPUI. Her primary expertise is in university school partnerships, collaborative after-school programs, and critical multicultural education. And finally, Dr. Santa Maria Graff, Christina Santa Maria Graff. She's an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Urban Teacher Education at IUPUI School of Ed, and her expertise is in bilingual and multicultural special ed and critical community engagement. So welcome all of our panelists, and Dr. Kazimbi, take it away.
Thank you very much. We are very excited to be here. Wanted to thank everyone who's joining us. We know you're out there. We wanted to thank you for joining us today for this very, very important session, for this very, very important conference. Our topic, of course, is the communal and ancestral knowledge for our Black children's survival. So what I'd like to do is just walk you through a little bit of this by first dealing with our outcomes. We have three basic, general, broad, foundational outcomes that we want to hit. And one of them among those is to identify these missed opportunities to redress the longstanding inequities that are exacerbated by COVID-19. We understand in our research and the work that I do in particular that COVID-19 and Black people's existence in the world today was always been a kind of a precarious existence, but now what we're dealing with, it's been coming on for a long time, is a comorbidity that is brought on by not only COVID, but also the very environment that is toxic, that is infused, if you will, with white supremacy, racism. And that is something that is sort of just hitting Black America in waves. And we're having to navigate and deal with this comorbidity, and that understanding that it actually exacerbates these inequities. Second outcome for this presentation, this segment, is to reiterate the assets of Black children and families. That is the resilience, that is the fortitude that we've exhibited through the centuries, all right, in terms of our survival and development. One of our late great scholars, Dr. Kobe Cambone, used to refer to it as an African survival thrust, but is that that inner strength, that inner reserve that Black people have always called upon. It is something that is very African, and it is something that has contributed to our being able to thrive and develop despite the worst of situations, despite the ravages of time and history and circumstance. We have been able to forge ahead, to build institutions, to make meaning, to embrace our culture, to embrace our Sankofa, or our cultural memory. So we want to reiterate the fact that these assets exist in Black children, in Black families, in Black communities throughout the African world, and certainly throughout the African diaspora. And then the third outcome, another broad outcome, is to consider the individual and collective work that is done that goes into addressing white supremacy, racism for the survival and development of Black children. This is very important because in my own work in particular, I understand that white supremacy is the #1 organizing principle in this country, and that everything from economics, entertainment, education, labor law, politics, religion, sex, and war is sort of terminated and comes out of that. And our experience with education is no different. All right, so those are just some broad outcomes. I want to move from that to dealing a little bit with the Black presence in early Indiana. We know that this presence is first documented circa 1746, the middle of the 18th century. Well, we got this first report of African Americans or Black folk in what was known then as the Northwest Territory or the Indiana Territory. This is before, of course, Indiana became a state. And then we're moving from there to around pre-1861, where we found documented reports of early Black urban and rural settlements in most of Indiana's 92 counties, including Marion County, where we are right now. And you see the lovely picture down there of the Grand Master W.E.B. Du Bois with his Grand Master wife, Dr. Shirley Graham Du Bois, born in Indianapolis in 1896. What do we know is significant about 1896 as we talk about these issues is that is the year of Plessy versus Ferguson. That is the year that the United States Supreme Court, of course, handed down the decree that essentially created apartheid, white supremacy, and made it the law of the land in the United States, essentially turned it into an apartheid state and upholding the constitutionality of white supremacy, specifically in public places and public facilities. So Shirley Graham Du Bois came into the world at the very exact time of the hour, maybe 5 months right before, 5 months after Plessy v. Ferguson was enacted. So 1861, we also see on the books, Indiana was passing and enacting numerous laws and codes that were developed by the pro-slavery political leaders of what became the state of Indiana, that restricted the rights of Black Americans in the so-called Northwest Territory. And then, of course, from 1816 forward, we get Indiana in achieving statehood, a new constitution, coupled with the Indiana Supreme Court rulings. We began to see the slow elimination of slavery, but we also, in indentured servitude. However, nothing was done to redress or restore the civil rights and the human rights that Indiana's growing Black population had were not entitled to. So you can see that the state constitution came in and utterly held up, if you will. This actually some 80 years before Plessy v. Ferguson, there was already still a sort of a white supremacy context in which Black folk had to survive and develop. So 1914, 1970, of course, we get the two great migrations. First of all, they are coterminous with World War I and World War II. World War I, 1911, 1914. We see 1.1 million Black people coming up out of the dirty South and coming into the Jim Crow North, looking for what Dr. Richard Wright called the warmth of other suns, looking for new jobs, new opportunities to escape the Jim Crow racial terrorism of the South, where we know between roughly 1860s all the way up into the really the 1960s, we began to see over 4,000 Black men and women lynched in the South. So there was a great impetus for Black folk to sort of roll out of the South and into the northern centers, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Cleveland, Ohio, and of course, Indiana. Then, of course, 1939, 1945 marks World War II, where we saw an additional nearly 6 million Black people. This mass exodus of Black folk out of the South. So now that it emptied out the majority of the Black Southern population, and now they found themselves in urban centers, hoping to find new opportunities and new ways of engaging employment and schooling. But what they encountered instead was chronic white supremacy, discrimination, racial terrorism, forced to live in racially segregated towns and cities and environments within cities, such as Chicago's Black Belt, where I'm from, all right? So from their own resources, even despite that, despite the wave of white supremacy, racism, and these pogroms against Black life, from everything from the sundown towns, which still exist in Indiana, to white capping, to the Ku Klux Klan, to the emergence of the white citizens councils and things, despite all of that, Black people have always reached down within themselves and found that resilience sprung from their resources, their inner resources, spiritual reserves, through their own self-help and sharing to create their own institutions. That is, in fact, how Indiana Avenue emerged. We know Indiana Avenue, of course, for its famous jazz scene, but this was essentially a jazz scene that came about because of white supremacy, Jim Crow segregation in the city of Indianapolis. Black folk then turned around and created what we call Black entertainment boulevards, such as Indiana Avenue. All right, 1862 continuing, we also see the impetus of the mob violence continuing with the 1851 Constitution, which banned Black migration into the state. Black people, Black men barred from voting, serving in militia, bearing witness in trials involving whites, and sending children to public schools. This is the context. White supremacy, racism, Jim Crow discrimination. This is the context in which Black people had to emerge, had to survive, had to develop, had to raise children, had to marry, had to try to eke out a living in this type of environment. And as the sign says here, despite the prejudice, by 1860, more than 11,000 Black people resided in Indiana. All right. Moving on, we see also the continue. This is a period photo of the Ku Klux Klan honoring their ancestors down in Muncie, Indiana in 1922. Even despite that, the images that are superimposed on this image again show, as you see here in Crawford County, a period photo, the sepia photo on the left, of Black children at a school in Crawford County, Indiana, attempting to, again, pursue education. You see the emergence of almost a quasi-Black middle class emerging in the 1920s and 30s, as documented in the book, Indiana Blacks in the 20th Century, bringing it all the way present day with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor, the racial protest uprisings that are still essentially challenging Black survival, challenging Black existence, challenging Black life, at all turns. So there's this question, there's been this lingering question as to the subject citizenship of Black people. And we have been in this mode of having to contest for citizenships and rights, and actually having to be on a hamster wheel, trying to repeat this thing again and again and again as we continue our sojourn in the tradition of our ancestors, all right? Moving it even more into a modern context, out of the 20th century into the 21st century, white racism and the crumbling of a city. This is a piece that was done, I believe, in the Atlantic magazine. Did an interesting piece in 2018 on Unigov. And I think the Indianapolis Star newspaper just last week did a piece on Unigov, exploring how racial segregation and the declining enrollment that plagues Indianapolis public schools today can be traced back to that decision made 46 years ago to merge Indianapolis with its surrounding suburbs, concentrate white power in the city, diminish Black voting power, diminishing Black voting districts, as they're doing in Kentucky right now. And then, of course, the terminus, the punctuation on this slide is that in 200 years, as Indiana celebrates a bicentennial, in 200 years, this city has only had white men as mayor. So we got to really question that in the context, in the modern day contemporary context, that Black folk in Indiana and Indianapolis and throughout the state are still having to survive and contend with these forces that are out here. We have to be strong, and we have to be courageous, and we have to tell the truth about what it is that we see. As the great Chinese philosopher Confucius said, the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their proper name. And that's what we have to do. Let's switch on over to the Southern Poverty Law Center and look at the data that they've collected on over 20 hate groups tracked in Indiana as of 2019. Again, dealing with the context in which Black people have to live, work, learn, and play, in a context where you see not only the continuation and the re-entrenchment of white supremacy, racism, anti-Black racism, but also the comorbidity with the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. Speaking of which, intersections of racism, the color and the comorbidity of coronavirus, we can see that Black Americans are dying at 3 times the rate of whites nationally. COVID-19 deaths of Black folk who make up only 13% of the US population, yet 1 in 4 of the COVID-related deaths are of Black Americans, all right? And then we can see that a recent white paper, a small report that came out last week, Harvard University epidemiologists estimated that on average, deaths in the United States due to COVID, we have lost over 138,000 years of life. Within those demographics, buried within those demographics, we pulled out the fact that Black Americans to date have lost something like 46,000 years of life owing to COVID. Age-adjusted COVID-19 associated hospitalization rates by race and ethnicity. You can see here where First Nations people, non-Hispanic Black, and of course Latinx are the 3 biggest groups that are facing the ravages of this comorbidity of coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic, plus white supremacy racism that we're dealing with. Intersections of racism, the color of coronavirus, as I wrap this up, key findings collected through July 7th that shows that the actual US death rates from COVID-19 aggregated across all states, you can see 1,450 Black Americans has died. That's roughly 70 deaths per 100,000 people, right? And the terminus at the bottom of this slide, if they, all of these people, Indigenous Americans, Pacific Islanders, Latinx folk, white people, Asian Americans, and of course, Black people, who our focus is today, if they had died of COVID-19 at the same actual rate as whites, about 16,000 Black people will still be alive, 2,200 Latinx brothers and sisters, and 400 Indigenous Americans. So we got to question the misleadership coming out of the White House. You got to question the misleadership coming out of other centers of power and influence, where people, these are not just mere statistics, this is life and death that is buried in these statistics. And this is something that I think would provide a really good analysis as we continue the analysis of dealing with education and our relationship to education. So I'm going to stop there and turn this over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Skelton, and she's going to give you some more.
Thank you, Dr. Kazimbe. We can advance the slide once. So it's against this backdrop, it's against this social historical, we can go back one, that'd be great. Against this social historical backdrop, am I allowed, oh yeah. That we think about how our children, how our educators are entering our school systems today. It is against everything that Dr. Kazimbe talked about, including the statistics that impact the emotionality that we're bringing into the reopening of our school systems. When we think about systemic racism, we're not only thinking about the sort of overt evidence of racism, but the structural presence and demonstration of racism, from the disproportionate rate of COVID-19 for Black people and Indigenous people of color, to the job loss and financial hardship, dealing with grieving in terms of disproportionate rates of death in the face of the pandemic, loss of loved ones and due to health problems and incarceration, changes in rites of passage. Many people are experiencing having to give up important traditions that helps to fortify who they are and helps to bring up and tap into those strengths, having to avoid and not be able to commune and connect with one another because of social distancing. And just the high rates of state witnessing and experiencing, whether directly or indirectly, high rates of state-sponsored violence. We can advance the slide forward. So I wanted to pause and for us to think about the social emotional impact on students as they are dealing with these issues. and how these issues are then demonstrated and manifested in behavior. So these are various ways in which both youth and adults, but I want to focus a little bit on right now on our young people, on our youth, will deal with anxiety and how anxiety will show up. So our young people are going to be angry. We're angry, right? We're angry with the loss of connection. We're angry about the emotional impact. We're angry that we're dealing with these kinds of fiscal financial losses. And that's going to show up in our young people, and they're going to demonstrate and act out that anger. It shows up in difficulties in sleeping and the impact of loss of sleep on our ability to concentrate, our ability to focus. It's going to show up and manifest in what may be characterized as defiant behavior, avoiding interactions, avoiding work that may be adding to the stress that young people may be feeling. It may show up in the tendency of wanting to control and be over controlling. So the tendency to maybe want to over plan. And so these different ways that often are characterized as problematic behaviors, as defiance, as disobedient, as child misbehavior in our schools, we want to think about how we are framing these behaviors and what these behaviors are actually masking, what these behaviors are actually messaging. I'm not sure how to advance. Am I advancing or? Can we advance the slide? Yeah, thank you. So Indiana, as in most states, have received guidance on what to consider as schools are reopening. And what's highlighted in the in-class guidance from Indiana that school systems are using as a document to inform their own local district reopening plans is the emphasis on preparing for the academic aspects of school and schooling, but also the importance of addressing the emotional needs of our students. And I can't underscore the importance of us taking time to think about the emotional impact of our students and how we as educators, how we as adults are prepared to respond to the emotional impact, to support our students and each other as we deal with these converging pandemics.
Okay, so we're gonna also be talking about in class, the document that came from the state and its impact on families. I specifically work with families of children with disabilities, specifically Black families, Latino families, and other families of color who may or may not have English as their first language. So there are a multitude of different challenges that right now they've been telling me since March, particularly since March during COVID-19, that they've been experiencing, and I want to share that with you. So some of the state language is around, and we all know this, if a child becomes sick, then there are certain conditions that must be met in order for them to return. And there are specific areas that are of great challenge, particularly for Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latino families who are essential workers and have limited flexibility for taking time off. So I keep hearing the question, well, who is going to take care of my child if I have to work, particularly if they have disabilities? Another question that I have been getting is, how is my child going to learn remotely, particularly during times when we know that certain school districts here in Indiana and across the United States and across the world are looking at virtual platforms for instruction and continued ways in order to do distance learning. Some of the quotes that I've gathered from families, particularly Black families and Latino families, are, I don't have a strong internet connection at home. I don't have a laptop or tablet my child can use to access online materials. I don't know how to use technology well. And I don't know how to teach academic content to help my child. So these are some of the concerns that are coming up for families that I want to bring up and highlight. And this really gets to the challenge of limited access to necessary tools and resources. So that's something that we have to look at really, really carefully. So another issue for families, particularly for families of children with disabilities, is how, if the child needs to stay at home because of their disability or because of whatever circumstances, then the question I keep hearing is, how is my child going to continue receiving special education and other related services? For example, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language therapies, if due to health issues, he or she needs to remain at home. So some of the quotes I've gathered from families are, from the last few months are, during March and April, my son did not receive speech and language services. Another parent said, we did not receive consistent communication from the school. And yet another Latino family, and this is representative of several Latino families, said, there was no interpreter during the Zoom meetings to help me with communication. And this may not be across the board in every school district, but definitely there is inconsistent communication and, again, limited resources. You can move forward with the slide. So some of the ways that that I really want us to begin reframing what is occurring in our schools right now when we're thinking about reopening is, how can we reframe reopening specifically for Black students, students of color, students with disabilities, and students whose identities are intersectional. There's this whole, to do this, I'm really leaning on some of the framings and reframings from our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the idea and the concept of sovereignty. And sovereignty is rooted in ways of knowing that encapsulate language, sacred history, place, and ceremony. It's also an understanding that each person brings in cultural histories and legacies that are representative not only of that present moment, but of their past and how they can impact and influence the future. So when we hear terms, and I've heard, these are quotations on the left-hand side from people that I've worked with or heard from, particularly in education, this idea of, well, we need to make up for lost time, or that there's this sense of there's been wasted time for our children, or they've lost what they have learned. And I'm thinking, you know, you go in with that very linear way of thinking about time, as being, you know, time being lost, gained, or commodified, like in the adage, time is money, right? You're quantifying it through a very narrow scope. And in this example, we tend to view students, when we think about making up for lost time, by thinking by thinking only about time and students through a deficit lens. But what if instead we reframed this and saw the child for the totality of who they are in that moment and all of what they bring and all of what they've experienced, and think about reopening as a space of reimagining how we can meet them where they are in that moment, seeing the totality of who they are in that time and space. What if we have, and then in the second question, what have our students gained through this time of COVID-19? How if we asked that question, what have they gained instead of what have they lost? And what are the ways that they enter school with a new knowledge and understanding of the world around them? You can move to the next slide. So another couple of reframings. I've also heard, and this is a quote from that I write down my notes and I quote when people are talking, just to know where people stand and where they are, where they have their finger on the pulse. I've heard they haven't been supported, and these were educators talking about specifically Black families and Latino families. They haven't been supported in their learning at home. Well, how if we reframe that and instead thought about it as Black students and other students of color arrive at our schools carrying their collective and ancestral legacies. And like I said before, these legacies need to be recognized, honored, valued. And in the present moment, they are, in that specific moment, shaping their individual and collective futures while bringing a legacy of their past to inform what we can do for reimagining school spaces. Another thing that I've heard again and again, and this is particularly poignant for our families of children with disabilities at the intersections of race, language, and other identity markers, this idea of they are not able to learn. Well, let me tell you this, they are able to learn, and they learn in a multitude of ways. But these ways are often, when only seen through a very dominant white perspective, are oftentimes invisible, unrecognized, or erased by those ideologies that we've been entrenched in. So we need to reframe the way that we consider what learning is and what it looks like in different educational contexts, especially the home environment. So I'm gonna bring it on over to Dr. Skelton now.
Thank you, Dr. Santa Maria Graf. I want to pinpoint and connect to some of the points that you made, and also back to the points that Dr. Kazembe made. And that is this whole notion of reimagining, right? This whole notion of re-envisioning what our school cultures, what our school communities can look like in order to capitalize on and draw from that strength for survival and for to thrive that Dr. Kazembe talked about, that social historical strength that's a part of the cultural histories of our Black students. And so we use those strengths, we use those assets, we tap into them, and we leverage them to help fortify our Black, Indigenous, and students of color within our school communities by creating culturally responsive and sustaining, caring school communities. And so here I'm focusing on the concept of care, the concept of community, right? The concept of the collective, the concept of really tapping into the humanity of our students and of each other within the context of school and schooling. I'm going to talk through 3 major areas that can be the focus or the domains of work to create caring school communities that are fortifying for our Black students. The first is thinking about how are we making sure that in both in-person, face-to-face context, and as well as on online virtual learning communities, that we're creating communities that are inclusive, learning communities and school communities and classroom communities that are inclusive and supportive, right? That we're focusing on creating and building inclusive and supportive relationships paired with high expectations. And oftentimes, I think the way the rhetoric and discourse in education is that somehow these are mutually exclusive ideas. We can either be equitable and culturally responsive, or we can have high expectations. And that's a false dichotomy. In fact, having a loving, caring school community is about holding up both. And when we talk about having inclusive and supportive relationships paired with high expectations, what we're specifically talking about is demonstrating a value and respect for students' strengths that they bring into the classroom. Again, tapping into that cultural history, that ancestral history that all of our students have. Again, tapping into the assets that our students bring into our school spaces. To be that warm demander, right? Holding those high expectations, affirming our students. It's not that I know our students can learn, our students do learn. They learn, they bring with them a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of funds of knowledge that they have accumulated through interacting in their own communities, their own households, and that they bring that into the classroom. So how are we affirming students for who they are and our ability to support them in who they are? Practice this concept that Fortune talks about of fictive kin or other parenting. This whole notion of we're a family, we're a school family or a classroom family. We have brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles. And how do we demonstrate that kind of relationship within our school context? And then conducting those check-ins. I talked about the emotional impact that this particularly this summer has brought about. So checking in with our students, creating space for open dialogue. Every child's emotions are valid emotions, whether they're anger, whether they're frustration, whether it's sadness. These are valid emotions. And so how do we acknowledge that? And how do we provide opportunity for our students to constructively express what they're feeling? Next slide, please. The next area to focus on in this sort of creating this fortifying school context is the cultivation of cultural knowledge. The importance of promoting racial literacy. And by racial literacy, Wendan's Twine talks about this idea of helping children, particularly Black children, understand who they are, understand their own history, understand their own cultural knowledges, fortifying them by helping them really know authentically about the past, the present, and how they have contributed to the world's knowledge. So really helping our young people develop their own racial literacy. So much of our histories has been sort of erased and marginalized through instruction in our schools. How do we center the cultural knowledges, the cultural practices, the cultural histories of Black students to confront stereotypes that are promoted within our curriculum materials, and also stereotypes that are communicated in everyday interactions in the form of microaggressions. So every time you observe, experience a stereotype, to confront that stereotype, not to let it pass, and to work alongside our parents, our community members, and our students to create counter narratives to the dominant narrative of white supremacy that permeates through every aspect of our schooling in the United States. To focus on valuing multiple intersecting identities. So Christina talked about, students with disabilities, but students with disabilities are also students who are Black, or students who whose home language may be something other than English. Students who are also members identify as LGBTQ+. So we all bring with us multiple intersecting identities that are very important to uphold and very important to recognize. Many of our students bring with them multiple intersecting marginalized identities. So how are we respecting that and appreciating that and planning ways to support our students to embrace their identities? Using representative literature and curriculum materials with authentic voices from members of the Black community. So it's not other people writing about Black people, but Black people writing about their own experiences, telling their own stories, and using those curriculum materials as part of the learning process. And then recognizing the wisdom that our families, that our parents and our caregivers bring and incorporate that wisdom within our school context, and to position ourselves as educators, as learners, as we engage with our families and parents. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this focus on creating environments, schooling environments that focus on both individual and collective empowerment. This is so much a part of the historical work of Black communities, right? That empowerment, that collective empowerment. We've had to work to empower ourselves to address and many of the obstacles and barriers that Black people face, both at the macro level and at the micro level. So we want to create learning environments where we're actually supporting our students and honing those skills, to focus on supporting interdependency and reciprocity, that it's about caring for one another. And how do we collectively care for one another as we fight for full enfranchisement in our society? Supporting students to use tools and knowledge resources from multiple communities for critiquing marginalizing policies, practices, status quo structures that create barriers for equitable access to resources and power. So helping our students hone the skills to critique those status quo policies and practices and empower them to make decisions to lead for social change. And how do we do that individually for ourselves, but also collectively as a community? Next slide, please. So I'll turn it over now to Dr. Flowers.
All right. Be still, my ancestors, and rest, for in me your spirit shall be revived. This is a line from a poem from Carsonia E. Wise. I think Sister Carsonia's name has changed over the years, but I still quote it the same. This particular line is sort of my prayer and my goal each time I speak with my people, each time I speak with others who say they are invested in the survival and success of my people. So I also join my colleagues today in understanding that everything we say today is part of the spirit and the ongoing efforts to abolish racism and to uphold and really to support the assets of our Black children. So I want to thank my colleagues for articulating the historical context and really the harsh realities of white supremacy and the culturally responsive possibilities for schools, and also what has been documented as as positive and productive approaches for our children. I want to go back to the notion of anti-racism in education, only to give us another framework as part of the presentation for us to think and just always remember that we are fighting white supremacy as we are lifting the voices and considering the strengths and really acknowledging the power of our youth. We understand we're doing all that within this racist structure. So critical race theorists, other theorists who are also in the fight against racism, talk a lot about particular thrusts that should be a part of the movement. And Latson Billings wrote an article, oh my goodness, almost 20 years ago, that is still very relevant. And she's asking the question, what is critical race theory doing in a nice place like education? And I always go back to that article because we often don't want to talk about race. We know it exists. Most of us, see it, live it, experience it, but we often don't know how to talk about it within the context of policy change, in the context of curriculum development. And so I am grateful to my colleagues for actually everything that's been said to this point is a part of an anti-racist, culturally responsive framework and culturally affirming framework. So I appreciate that. So the three thrusts that you have before you come from Latson Billings, who was summarizing the purposes of any anti-racist work. The deconstruction of oppressive structures, really it's when we call it out and we say, where is racism? Where does it live? Where is it sustained? Who is upholding it? And how is it working? We need to know these things. We can't say that we are doing the work and that we are actually changing something and we don't know what it is. And so some examples of that, and many of us have been a part of these activities that I'm listing in this broad way, and then I'm going to move to more specific localized efforts. But anytime we're a part of book clubs where we're looking at how things are articulated, how racism is described, how oppression is articulated, dialogue sessions, guest speakers, conferences, when we're gathering data and analyzing it, we're putting it on the table. And nobody should be walking out of a room misunderstanding or misinterpreting what, these realities. The reconstruction of human agency, we've actually talked about that a lot today already, in that the people should get to decide who is speaking for them, and also be a part of any changes, any policies, any practices that directly impact them. And we've known forever, just as scholars in education, as educators, as community members, as parents, that the people that need to be in the room are not always in the room. And so I appreciate my colleague, Dr. Santa Maria Graff, and her very specific questions and concerns that come out of her interactions with parents, with family members, because those concerns need to be at the table with the protocols, with the list of things to do in terms of reopening schools, and just rethinking and reframing. And then lastly, construction of equitable and socially just relations of power. And this is where it gets tricky, because we can call racism out, we can appreciate the assets of our Black children, but we get to this point where we actually have to talk about who is in charge. We actually have to talk about who gets to decide which schools get money, which schools are closed and renamed and reconfigured. All of that is about a power structure. And so today we're talking with you about how can we do any of this work in and outside and along schools where the power structure, it's not all white people sitting in a room talking about what's best for Black children. That statistic about our city never having a person of color, never having a Black leader, we need to do something about that. And I just put that out there for us to think about. If we have any folks out there who are interested in politics, let us know so we can support you, because there's room for you in state and city politics and in federal politics. Also, I wanted to just say that in part of the conversations around power, there has to be an accountability framework. And again, this is when things get tricky, because we can all sit in the room and we can say we appreciate human agency, we appreciate assets, we identify and articulate where racism is, but we still have to figure out ways in which people who are the most knowledgeable about racist and oppressive structures, who have done the work to abolish and to eradicate, and who have strong relationships with Black communities, Indigenous communities, Latinx communities, that they're actually in leadership roles, and they're actually helping to write the reports and to change the system. You can advance the slide. Now, one of the things that we joke about, but we're very serious about in education, is not recreating the wheel. And we talk about that a lot. But the other part of that is as we acknowledge what work has been done before today or after today, it is still important for us to think about how we hold these organizations accountable. So I'm going to walk through some examples of what's happening in the city. Forgive me for not, for lack of a comprehensive list, but I do want us to recognize that there are school leaders, there are teachers, there are community organizations and churches that are doing the work and have been doing it before 2020, before COVID-19. But again, we need to figure out how to collaborate, how to initiate, but we still need to know what's been done before us. So under deconstruction of oppressive structures, reconstruction of human agency, and construction of equitable and socially just relations of power, I've listed a few examples, and I'm going to be as concise as I can be. But under deconstruction of oppressive structures, I wanted to give some credit to IPS in the development of the Racial Equity Institute. I have talked to principals and teachers who have participated, and they become more aware, of statistics, of things that we take for granted in terms of curriculum, in terms of how we make decisions about children of color, about Black children. So I wanted to just, give credit to that. There's also the IPS Community Coalition that is, a group of community members. I know that some educators are involved, teacher educators, education scholars are involved in that. And that group is, one of its sole purposes is to hold IPS accountable for the work that it does and for the successes of children that attend the school and supporting families. But a lot of that work is also, challenging what the power structures are and making sure that, agency is prioritized. Wayne Township also has an equity team. I know that they examine policies and practices. I believe that they were working on anything from their literacy development program, their English as a new language programs, and I know that they have analyzed their own data in terms of disproportionality in classroom discipline. So these are just examples of, you know, sitting around the table, thoughtful, being very thoughtful about what is happening in our schools, where are the missed opportunities, where are the gaps. I know that as a parent, I have received a few links to surveys around, you know, how are you doing right now in terms of COVID-19. And I know that there are districts and organizations that have done town halls even before COVID-19. And we want to encourage as much data gathering, you know, with families and with stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I mean families, people who bring their children to school and trust us to do right by their children. And then I did want to this is just a simple shout out to the superintendents in Marion County Public Schools who put together a 2-minute video, and they are very specific about professional learning as a priority for their teachers, for their leaders, for their staff, and then also understanding that that there has to be solidarity if there is going to be any real fight against racial and structural inequities. You know, I wouldn't be me if I didn't speak to some of the work that my colleagues in the School of Education have done with school districts. My colleague and our dean, Dr. Tamara Jackson, led the effort to have the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools within IPS. And as far as I know, it was successful. And we had Black children, we had Latinx children, we had white children there. But one of the most important pieces of that is that the curriculum is culturally affirming, and there is emphasis on taking a stance against discrimination, stereotyping, and racism. So these are the programs that help to sustain our cultural strengths and our legacies. And fortify them, which is one of my favorite words. I appreciate Dr. Skelton's use of the word. And also, I want to just, you know, give some credit to IPS in Wayne Township for working with us on, you know, after school programs. Recently, I was able to work with Garden City, and this was actually last year. I was able to work with teachers in Garden City who were wanting to put together a program. I wanted to put together a program that was related to, you know, just basically supporting youth's understanding of their own agency and the fact that there have always been young people that speak out against inequities. And so part of that program was, you know, reading skill literacy development, and then opportunities for them to read and engage literature written about young people that have fought the good fight, you know, and in civil rights and beyond, before civil rights, during civil rights, and beyond. And then lastly, I know I have here an IPS racial equity policy, and I don't think that is the right name for it. I believe it is the IPS Board of Education Black Lives Matter resolution. So I apologize for that. But in that resolution, they acknowledge the collective failures. And that to me is significant, to acknowledge collective failures and to publicly commit and invest in audits and a reconfiguration of schools that is the absolute best for our children. So that was, gosh, I think that might have been voted on just this summer. So that is something that we'll hear more about probably in the, you know, in the fall and beyond. And another example, Washington Township actually has on their website a call to action. You click on it and it's a form. You know, it looks pretty you know, harmless. But then you read through the ways in which they're asking parents, family members, concerned citizens to contribute beyond just volunteering or being on a committee. I wanted to point out that they're also asking for, you know, any ways that they can connect with other people doing the work. So if you know of other public schools, other organizations that are helping to working on the racial gaps, if you will, that, you know, come see us. We want to do that same work with you and learn from you. So I think that's pretty significant to note. So these are just some examples. And again, this is part of the process of abolishing racism. Just having the programs, that's important. I know people are doing the work. Part of this presentation is really asking the question, you know, who is willing to do the long-term sustainable investment in this work? And okay, I think there's one more slide. And I'm going to wrap up because I know that we are right on the edge of the Q&A. And this slide is just a reminder of, or just a public display of what I've seen, especially, and what some of my colleagues have seen as we are supporting pre-service teachers and school leaders and practicing teachers in schools. Again, this list of, you know, just a reminder of the fact that students do come to, they enter the school with all of this brilliance and all of this creativity and all of this curiosity that we cannot, you know, smother, and that we, you know, that we can't snuff out because of, you know, these very harsh protocols and practices that we know don't work for our children. And then the other two images here are basically examples, really snapshots of what I have witnessed and what some of my colleagues have witnessed in schools. So the question really for us is, who is willing to invest and to, you know, to continue to promote what is really happening in schools, and that, so that it's not just, oh, these are some great things that are happening, you know, behind closed doors. Like, this should be part of the conversations around what do we need to do. So there are people doing good work, but we don't always give them the credit, and it's not always part of and aligned with the institutional mission and values and practices. Okay,
Woo.
I'll wrap up there. I know that's a lot. I'm sorry.
This was so hot. I cannot tell you all how many wonderful, positive, life-giving comments came through. So thank you all so much. As a Black mother of sons, as a doc student, as a colleague, as a fan of all of you all, this was awesome. And so we are going to go into Q&A, lots of Q&A. We will not be able to get to all of them. A major one was about the presentation in the PowerPoint. And so IBE is recording all the sessions except for the keynote speakers, and will be posting them to their YouTube channel. Everybody who registered will get that link when they're posted. Additionally, though, I know Dr. Kazimbi, since you started it out and the slides were so informative, people were asking specifically, could you share them and so forth. So however you all want to do that, that is fine. If you want to register for one of his classes, a lot of your students are on here as well. And so they're giving you shouts out and saying, this is very reminiscent of classes with you all. So let's dive into questions. Also, real quick, in the chat is the link for the survey. Do not forget to fill that out or copy it and paste it. Okay, so here's a question that we have, and it is from, sounds like an educator, and they want to know, how do I approach my top administrators and share my concerns about the lack of training for cultural awareness and competency? They want to hear from Black educators and have the uncomfortable conversations. And so unfortunately, the principal didn't handle that well. And so, yeah. How do they approach their top administrators and share concerns. Dr. Kazemi or Dr. Flowers?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that question. I think one of the things we have to do is disabuse ourselves of the notion that when we talk about equity and we talk about justice, it's not just for people of color, and it's not just for those who are oppressed and marginalized. Equity and justice and truth is for our collective humanity, right? It is for anyone who is interested in becoming more fully human.
Right.
So I would start there with saying that, you know, this is not some controversial stance. I'm not radical. We're not radical. We're normal.
That's right.
We are normal because we are giving a response to a condition in which we have to navigate. So I'd start there, and start there also by Dr. Flowers pointed out something that is of major importance. I've only been in this state for 4 years. I'm from the South Side of Chicago, but there are so many people, organizations that are doing such positive, affirming work. Dr. Pat Payne is an institution, and
Yes,
there's so many people within this city that are doing so much work. So all one has to do really is to open one's eyes, right? And attach oneself to the work and efforts and things that are already ongoing. They're doing some magnificent, great and wondrous work in the community. These are people who don't often get invited into spaces like this, but they're doing the work, and they've been doing the work for decades upon decades. So there's already good work and good efforts that are going on around the city. So I would urge that person to look to the left and right and to do a simple little Google search, man. You gotta love these algorithms. You do a simple little Google search to find out what is going on within a 5-mile radius of where you are. Chances are there's some positive, affirming, good people of all color groups, of all persuasions and backgrounds that are doing this great and wondrous work. And all you have to do is attach yourself to it, waiting on you to show up. That's how I would respond to that.
Absolutely.
Dr. Flowers, a couple of people wanted to know if you could share the title of the Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings article from 20 years ago. I think I know it, but I will let you.
It's what is critical race theory in education, and what is it doing in a nice place like education? I mean, and that's, yes, that's rough. I think I added a couple of extra words in there.
Okay,
but you know what? Hold on.
Okay.
Yes, just what is critical theory?
Okay.
Oh, you know what? Okay, oh, here it is. Just what is critical theory, and what's it doing? What's it doing in a nice field like education?
Okay, thank you.
All right.
We have another question, and Dr. Sandmer-Graf or Dr. Skelton. The question is, now that my district has decided to go online learning for the start of the year, what's next? How can I best provide for all of my students?
Christine, you want to start first?
Okay, I'll start, and you can piggyback on the conversation. So there are a few things to consider when you are thinking about online platforms, virtual platforms. And the one thing I keep hearing from families is that their voices are not being heard in the decision-making processes that impact how those platforms are being rolled out. So if you are really committed to this work, please open up more spaces for your families to not only just provide like a survey and give, you know, like I would say go beyond just the survey, go beyond just the questionnaire, like actually open it up to more qualitative ways for them to share they want to be heard. So a survey doesn't always reach our Black and brown families of color. In fact, for a lot of Latino families who are feeling very oppressed right now during these times, for many different reasons, for immigration reasons, citizenship reasons, language, a survey isn't going to really get them motivated to share what they want to say. So it's also finding cultural liaisons within the community that can be really representative of those families' voices and providing a platform of safety, first of all. And then secondly, where they can be really open with what they have to say. And when I say open, I mean, we have to be willing to hear the difficult critiques that our communities that they're experiencing. And if we're really committed to this work, then it's sitting and actively listening and not interrupting those critiques, really taking it in and saying, what can I do? How can we work together? How can we co-create, co-negotiate, think of ways that we can meet the needs of our families and our community members? That is not only meaningful to them, but that's going to actually uplift our whole community as a whole. And so I just want to put that out there, that it has to go beyond just a survey, just beyond a questionnaire. That's like a start, but the deeper conversations have to be happening, maybe virtually, online, in like town hall kind of formats where people can really speak and they can be safe to speak with and say what they have to say.
Wonderful. Dr. Scouten, you want to add?
If I can add to that, and I'm going to get really pragmatic with some of the advice or feedback. One is around ensuring that you are planning both vertically, in terms of vertical planning with educators, and horizontally. What we've learned, I think, in the spring when we did that mass shift, like overnight shift, is that every teacher was trying to create their own kind of online learning lesson plan, which require a lot of extra time, and without necessarily thinking about how, I don't want to say maybe not thinking about, but maybe not considering households that have multiple children at multiple grade levels that will be engaging online learning at the same time.
Yes.
So it's not only if a household has a computer, but if you're a household with 3 children or 4 children,
That's right.
and they're all online at the same time, each of those children have to have a device. And if they're online at the same time, then that's taxing the if you have broadband,
Right.
that's still taxing that broadband, right? And if every class has an assignment that's anywhere between 4 to 45 minutes class period, then that's how long is that? How long are you asking for a child to sit in front of a computer all day?
Yeah.
And so I think some of that, it just requires just real pragmatic and coming together collaboratively and thinking, this helps us become, I think, maybe more focused teachers. What are the specific goals of this learning experience? And how can we really create an environment or a lesson or lessons that's engaging, that's interdisciplinary, so we don't have to so we can cover a science objective, English language objective, and a math objective, maybe in the same lesson, so that we could begin to really hone in and think about how much time we're asking children to sit in front of computers, how many computers are in a household. If you have multiple children and engaging, what does that mean for the structures that are required, and also the space. So I'm in my house right now, as most of us are in our own spaces. Many of us, so I'm in my own house. If I had another person who had to be online, they would have to be in a different space. Otherwise, they're hearing my voice, and that's interrupting what they're hearing. Well, many of our families are in homes where there's not that much space for people to be spread out, right? And so if we have 3 children, each of those children, each child has to be in their own space. What if you're in a 2-bedroom apartment?
Right.
So to begin to think about just the sort of pragmatics of what it takes to be online and to learn.
Yeah.
Also to think about the actual technology. So many of our teachers we're really excited, I think, being creative about using different apps and learning management systems. Each of those apps required a login, required a password, required all of these sort of requisite skill sets. One student could theoretically have to be knowledgeable about and connect to 15 different apps in one grade level.
Were you in my house over the beginning of the pandemic?
But this is what we learned, right?
Yes.
So as educators, when we come together and collaboratively plan, both horizontally, grade level planning, and vertically, we can begin to hone in. We're going to use these 3 apps, period, for all of our students. We're going to sort of co-plan, and we're going to plan interdisciplinary so that we can cover multiple goals and objectives and lessons.
All right, thank you. We are really out of time. I just want everyone to, again, make sure that you go to the link in the chat for the evaluation. That is critically important. And I also want to say thank you to all of our panelists. You all were wonderful. And we didn't get to all of the questions, but I know, again, that the session was recorded. It will be posted on their YouTube channel. And I am going to say goodbye. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Do we get access? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr.
Well, I was going to just mention a lot of people seem to be asking for the presentation.
Yes.
If we can be reached at the School of Education. You can find you got our names because they're in the session, but just look us up at the IUPUI School of Education, and we're happy to provide the presentation to people who'd like to have it.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, Dr. Flowers.
Oh, I was just asking, so will we have access to these questions if we wanted to respond? And you probably said this already and I missed it.
I do think that you will, yes.
Oh, thank you. I see Jennifer's note. Yes, okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, we're committed to going through them and doing the best we can to answer some of them.
Of course, thank you.
Okay.
You all are wonderful. Everyone have a great rest of your day. I hope you enjoyed this session. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.